Judge Robert Harwick leans back in his chair, a smirk spreading across his face as he watches the young public defender fumble through her paperwork. "Miss Mitchell, perhaps if you spent less time in law school and more time in the real world, you'd understand how these cases actually work," he says, his voice dripping with condescension. The packed courtroom erupts in uncomfortable murmurs as 17-year-old Jaylen Carter sits frozen at the defendant's table, watching his lawyer being humiliated. "Your Honor, with all due respect," Lisa Mitchell begins, but Judge Harwick cuts her off with a dismissive wave. "Respect? You want to talk about respect? This is my courtroom, and I decide." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. A distinguished man in an impeccable navy suit strides down the aisle, his presence commanding immediate attention. Every head turns as he approaches the bench and places a firm hand on Jaylen's shoulder. "That's enough. Your Honor, I am Justice Benjamin Carter of the United States Supreme Court, and that young man is my son." The courtroom falls into stunned silence. Judge Harwick's face drains of all color. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." 17-year-old Jaylen Carter adjusted his tie for the third time as he walked through the hallowed halls of Jefferson High School, his leather messenger bag filled with advanced placement textbooks and debate team materials slung across his shoulder. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the prestigious academic institution, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors that reflected his determined stride. Jaylen wasn't just any student at Jefferson High. He was the captain of the debate team, president of the student government, and maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA while taking the most challenging courses the school offered. His teachers often remarked that he possessed an unusual combination of intellectual brilliance and natural leadership that reminded them why they'd entered education in the first place. In AP government class, he could dissect constitutional amendments with the precision of a seasoned legal scholar. During Model United Nations conferences, he commanded respect from students twice his size simply through the power of his articulate arguments and unwavering moral compass. His best friend, Marcus, often joked that Jaylen was born wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase, but the truth was more complex. Jaylen had learned early that excellence wasn't optional in his household. It was expected, earned, and never taken for granted. His mother, Angela Carter, was a renowned civil rights attorney who had argued cases before federal appellate courts. His father traveled frequently for work that Jaylen understood to be important, but deliberately kept vague. During family conversations, the Carter family lived in a modest but well-appointed home in the Elmwood neighborhood, a middle-class community where academic achievement was valued and college preparation started in elementary school. Their dinner table conversations revolved around current events, legal precedents, and the importance of using one's education to serve others. Angela would often quiz Jaylen on landmark Supreme Court cases, while his father listened quietly, occasionally offering insights that seemed unusually sophisticated for someone whose specific job title remained mysteriously unspecified. At school, Jaylen navigated the social dynamics with the same strategic thinking he applied to academic challenges. He was equally comfortable discussing quantum physics with the Science Olympiad team and organizing fundraisers for local community organizations. His teachers appreciated his willingness to challenge conventional thinking while remaining respectful of opposing viewpoints. During heated classroom debates about controversial topics, Jaylen demonstrated a remarkable ability to find common ground between opposing positions while never compromising his core principles. Mrs. Gloria Hampton, his favorite history teacher and debate coach, often pulled him aside after particularly impressive performances. "Jaylen, you have a gift for making complex ideas accessible to everyone," she would tell him. "That's not just intelligence, that's wisdom. Don't let anyone convince you to dim that light. These conversations meant more to him than she realized, reinforcing his belief that knowledge carried with it the responsibility to advocate for those without similar advantages. His extracurricular activities reflected his commitment to social justice and community service. He volunteered at the local legal aid clinic, helping translate documents for Spanish-speaking families navigating the immigration system. He organized voter registration drives at community centers and spent weekends tutoring younger students who struggled with standardized test preparation. These experiences exposed him to families facing challenges he'd never encountered personally, broadening his understanding of how systemic inequalities affected real people's daily lives. Despite his academic success and leadership roles, Jaylen remained grounded and approachable. He could often be found in the school library during lunch periods, either working on scholarship applications or helping classmates understand difficult concepts from their shared courses. His genuine interest in others' success, combined with his natural charisma, earned him respect across all social groups within the school's diverse student body. The college application process had been particularly exciting for Jaylen. Early admission letters from Harvard, Yale, and Stanford arrived within the same week, each offering substantial scholarship packages that recognized both his academic achievements and his potential for future leadership. His parents celebrated these accomplishments with characteristic restraint, emphasizing that opportunities created obligations to use those advantages responsibly. His relationship with his father was especially close, built around shared intellectual curiosity and long discussions about justice, fairness, and the role of law in society. Though his father's work kept him away from home frequently, their evening conversations were rich with philosophical discussions about constitutional interpretation, the balance between individual rights and collective security, and the ongoing struggle to fulfill America's founding ideals. These talks shaped Jaylen's worldview and reinforced his intention to pursue a legal career focused on civil rights and social justice. Teachers and administrators at Jefferson High frequently commented that Jaylen possessed maturity and perspective unusual for someone his age. He approached conflicts with diplomatic skill, mediated disputes between classmates with fairness that earned universal respect, and demonstrated leadership qualities that suggested a bright future in public service. His guidance counselor had already begun discussing early admission to accelerated law programs that would allow him to begin his legal education while completing his undergraduate degree. As Jaylen walked toward his AP constitutional law class that particular morning, he felt confident about his future and secure in his understanding of how the world worked. He believed that preparation, hard work, and moral integrity provided reliable protection against unfairness and injustice. His comfortable middle-class upbringing and academic success had shielded him from direct encounters with systemic bias, though his volunteer work had given him theoretical understanding of such challenges. The morning felt like any other as he settled into his seat and opened his constitutional law textbook to the chapter on due process rights, completely unaware that within hours he would experience firsthand how quickly a young black man's future could be derailed by circumstances beyond his control, regardless of his family's status or his own achievements. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was a sweltering Tuesday morning in August when everything changed for Darius Coleman. The heat inside Iron Gate was suffocating, made worse by the prison's ancient ventilation system that seemed designed more for punishment than comfort. Darius had just returned from his work detail in the prison laundry when Officer Keisha Washington approached. His cell with an expression he'd never seen before, a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. "Coleman," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no other guards were within earshot. "You got a legal call. Your daughter's attorney wants to speak with you. Says it's urgent about your appeal." Darius felt his heart race. Maya had been working for months to gather evidence for his innocence claim, and any call from her legal team could mean a breakthrough in his case. He followed Officer Washington through the maze of corridors toward the phone bank reserved for legal consultations. His mind racing with possibilities. The phone room was a cramped, windowless space with 6 individual booths, each equipped with a phone and a small chair. The conversations were supposed to be private. Attorney-client privilege was one of the few rights that inmates theoretically retained. As Darius settled into booth 3, Washington handed him the receiver with a small smile. "Take your time," she said. "This line is secure." The voice on the other end belonged to attorney Sarah Mitchell, a civil rights lawyer who had joined Maya's effort to prove Darius's innocence. Her words came fast and excited. "Darius, we've had a major breakthrough. We found the real killer, Marcus Webb, a drug dealer who was being protected by the same corrupt cops who framed you. He's agreed to testify in exchange for a plea deal." Darius gripped the phone tighter, scarcely believing what he was hearing. "Are you certain? This isn't some false hope?" "It's real, Darius. We have DNA evidence that was suppressed during your trial witness testimony and Webb's full confession. Judge Patricia Hamilton has agreed to an emergency hearing next week. You could be out of there within the month." Tears formed in Darius's eyes, the first time he'd cried since his conviction. After 2 years of maintaining hope against overwhelming odds, vindication was finally within reach. The conversation continued for 20 minutes as Attorney Mitchell explained the legal process ahead and what to expect. As Darius hung up the phone, he sat for a moment, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd just learned. Soon he would be reunited with Maya, would be able to hug his granddaughter again, would be free to continue his fight for justice from outside these walls. But his moment of joy was shattered when the door to the phone room burst open. Warden Vincent Castellano strode in, his face twisted with rage. Followed closely by Sergeant Tommy Murphy and 2 other guards Darius didn't recognize. Well, Castellano sneered, his Brooklyn accent thick with malice. "If it isn't our celebrity inmate. Heard you been spreading lies about being innocent, getting people on the outside all worked up." Darius stood slowly, maintaining his composure despite the obvious threat in the warden's voice. "I was just speaking with my attorney about my legal appeal, Warden. That's my constitutional right." Castellano laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Constitutional rights? You're a convicted cop killer, Coleman. You gave up your rights when you murdered Officer Bradley in cold blood." "I didn't kill anyone," Darius replied firmly. "And my appeal will prove that." The warden's face darkened further. He was a man who had built his career on intimidation and control, rising through the correction system by breaking inmates' spirits rather than rehabilitating them. At 58 years old, Castellano ruled Irongate like a medieval lord, with absolute authority over the lives of 3,000 inmates. "Your appeal?" Castellano stepped closer, invading Darius's personal space. "Let me tell you something about appeals, convict. I've been running prisons for 25 years, and I've seen 1,000 guys like you, always claiming they're innocent, always thinking some fancy lawyer is gonna come save them. You know how many of those appeals actually work out?" Darius didn't respond, knowing that any answer would only escalate the situation. "None," Castellano continued, "because the system works. You're here because you belong here, and you're gonna die here. No amount of legal paperwork is gonna change that." Sergeant Murphy, who had been standing silently behind the warden, now stepped forward. At 6'4" and 280 pounds, Murphy was Castellano's enforcer, known throughout the prison for his casual brutality and complete loyalty to the warden. "Boss," Murphy said, his voice carrying the hint of violence that all inmates had learned to fear. "Maybe we should remind Mr. Coleman here about the reality of his situation." The threat was clear. But before anyone could act, Officer Washington appeared in the doorway. "Warden Castellano, sir, we have a situation in Block C that requires your immediate attention." "There's been an incident." Castellano glared at Darius for a long moment before stepping back. This conversation isn't over, Coleman. Not by a long shot. He turned to Murphy. Make sure our friend here gets back to his cell safely, and remind him about the rules regarding communication with outside agitators. As the group left, Murphy lingered for a moment, leaning close to Darius's ear. You think you're smart, don't you? Think you're better than the rest of us because you got some college education and military background. Let me tell you something. In here, none of that matters. In here, the only thing that matters is what the warden says. And the warden says you're going to learn your place. The next few days brought a systematic campaign of harassment clearly orchestrated by Castellano. Darius's mail was delayed or lost. His commissary privileges were suspended for minor infractions that other inmates committed daily without consequence. His work detail was changed to the most dangerous assignment in the prison, kitchen duty, with a crew known for violence against inmates who didn't fit in. Most ominously, word began spreading through the prison grapevine that Darius was a snitch who was cooperating with federal investigators. In prison culture, being labeled an informant was often a death sentence. Inmates who crossed that line found themselves isolated, targeted, and sometimes killed by fellow prisoners seeking to prove their loyalty to the unwritten code of silence. Professor Jones, his cellmate, watched these developments with growing concern. They're trying to break you, he observed during one of their evening conversations. This is textbook intimidation. The Millbrook County Juvenile Detention Center felt like stepping into an alternate universe where everything Jaylen had learned about justice and fairness seemed inverted. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with an irritating persistence, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look guilty regardless of their actual circumstances. The institutional green walls, scuffed floors, and pervasive smell of industrial disinfectant created an atmosphere designed to break down dignity and hope. During the intake process, Jaylen maintained the respectful demeanor his parents had taught him, even as each procedure stripped away another layer of his normal identity. His debate team pin was confiscated, along with his watch, and the small cross necklace his grandmother had given him for his confirmation. The intake officer, a tired-looking woman with skeptical eyes, processed his paperwork with mechanical efficiency. First time in the system? She asked, without looking up from her computer screen. When Jaylen confirmed this, she shook her head slightly. They always say that. You'll learn quick enough how things work around here. Keep your head down, don't make enemies, and maybe you'll get out without too much trouble. The holding cell contained 3 other teenagers, each at different stages of resignation to their circumstances. Andre Wilson, a 16-year-old with intelligent eyes and prematurely aged expression, looked up when Jaylen entered. What they get you for? He asked with the casual tone of someone accustomed to such introductions. Drug distribution, Jaylen replied, still barely believing the words himself. But I didn't do anything. I was in the library when whatever happened supposedly occurred. This is all a mistake. Andre nodded knowingly. Yeah, man, we're all innocent in here. The thing is, innocent don't matter much once you're sitting in this cell. What matters is what lawyer you can afford and what judge you draw for your hearing. The reality of his situation began sinking in as hours passed without contact from his family. Jaylen had requested to call his parents immediately upon arrival, but was told that phone privileges would be available during designated hours the following day. The violation of his rights was clear, but challenging it from inside a locked cell seemed impossibly difficult. They always do that, explained Marcus Rodriguez, another cellmate who'd been waiting for his own hearing for 3 days. Make you wait. Wear you down, get you thinking maybe you should just plead guilty to whatever they're offering. The system's designed to make fighting back as hard as possible. As night fell, Jaylen lay on the thin mattress trying to process the day's events. Every logical part of his mind insisted this was a temporary misunderstanding that would be resolved once proper legal representation reviewed the evidence. His parents would hire an excellent attorney. The security cameras would prove his innocence, and Mrs. Hampton's testimony would establish his alibi. Justice would prevail, because that's how the system was supposed to work. Yet the conversations with his cellmates gradually revealed how naive this faith might be. Andre had been waiting 6 weeks for a public defender to return his calls about a shoplifting charge, where the store's own security footage showed he'd paid for the items in question. Marcus faced assault charges for defending himself against 3 older boys who'd attacked him. But the other boys' families had hired private attorneys, while Marcus relied on overworked public defenders. The thing about public defenders, Andre explained during one of their late-night conversations, is they're good people trying to do impossible jobs. They got like 100 cases each, no time to investigate anything properly, and judges who assume their clients are guilty anyway. Your best hope is getting someone who cares enough to show up prepared. The next morning brought Jaylen's first phone call opportunity. With shaking hands, he dialed his mother's cell phone, praying she would answer despite the restricted number appearing on her caller ID. Angela Carter's voice came through the line with a mixture of relief and barely controlled fury. "Jaylen! Thank God you're all right. Mrs. Hampton called us immediately after your arrest. Your father's already making arrangements, and I'm driving to the courthouse now. Don't say anything to anyone without legal representation present. Do you understand me?" "Nothing at all. Mom, I didn't do anything wrong," Jaylen said, his voice finally breaking after hours of maintaining composure. "I was in the library the entire time. Mrs. Hampton can prove it. This is all some terrible mistake. I know, baby, I know. But right now, the mistake is real, and it's affecting your life. We're going to fix this, but you have to be strong and smart until we can get you out of there. Your father is handling things from his end, and I'm getting the best criminal defense attorney I can find." After ending the call, Jaylen felt simultaneously better and worse. Better because his family was mobilizing to help him, worse because their urgency suggested this situation was far more serious than he'd allowed himself to believe. The casual confidence he'd always felt about his future suddenly seemed fragile and uncertain. The day of his initial hearing arrived with agonizing slowness. Jaylen was transported to the courthouse in shackles, a humiliation that felt designed to broadcast guilt to anyone who saw him. The public defender assigned to his case, Lisa Mitchell, met him for the first time in a cramped conference room just 30 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin. Ms. Mitchell was clearly overwhelmed, juggling multiple case files while trying to absorb the basic facts of Jaylen's situation. Her questions were rushed, her attention divided, and her overall demeanor suggested someone barely keeping her head above water in an impossible professional situation. "The prosecutor is offering a plea deal," she said without preamble. "Possession with intent to distribute reduced to simple possession. Probation, community service, and a drug education program. It would keep you out of juvenile detention and minimize the impact on your future." Jaylen stared at her in disbelief. "But I'm innocent. I wasn't even near the place where this supposedly happened. We have witnesses who can prove I was in the library." Ms. Mitchell sighed deeply. "Jaylen, I understand your position, but fighting these charges means risking a trial where the penalties could be much more severe if you lose. The witnesses against you seem credible, and juries don't always respond well to—" She paused, searching for diplomatic language. "Defendants who don't fit their expectations." The unspoken racial dynamics hung heavy in the small room as Jaylen realized that his innocence might matter less than perceptions and stereotypes he'd never had to confront so directly before. 300 miles away in Washington, D.C., Justice Benjamin Carter sat in the Supreme Court's conference room reviewing briefs for the following week's oral arguments. The mahogany table stretched before him, covered with meticulously organized case files representing some of the most significant constitutional questions of the generation. As the court's newest member and its second African-American justice, Benjamin carried the weight of history alongside his judicial responsibilities. His assistant, Patricia Wells, knocked softly before entering. In 15 years of working together, first when Benjamin served on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals and now at the Supreme Court, Patricia had learned to read his moods and priorities with remarkable accuracy. Her expression carried an urgency that immediately commanded his attention. "Justice Carter, I apologize for interrupting, but there's an emergency call from your wife. She says it's about Jaylen and it can't—" "Wait." Patricia's typically composed demeanor showed cracks of genuine concern that told Benjamin this wasn't a routine family matter. Benjamin excused himself from the conference room and took the call in his private chambers, a space lined with law books and constitutional treatises that represented decades of legal scholarship. Angela's voice came through with controlled panic, the tone of someone accustomed to crisis management but personally affected in ways that tested her professional composure. "Ben, they arrested Jaylen at school yesterday on drug charges. It's completely fabricated. He was in the library with his debate coach when this alleged transaction occurred. They're trying to pressure him into a plea deal, and the public defender barely had time to read his file before recommending he accept it." Benjamin felt the familiar calm that had served him throughout his judicial career, even as paternal fury threatened to overwhelm his systematic thinking. Where is he being held? Who's the judge? What evidence do they claim to have? His questions came with the precision of someone accustomed to cutting through emotional static to reach factual foundations. Angela provided the details she'd gathered through her legal contacts and Mrs. Hampton's eyewitness account. The arrest appeared to be based on witness identifications that were suspiciously vague and potentially coached. The investigating officer had a history of problematic arrests involving young black men, though those patterns had never been officially documented or addressed. The initial hearing is this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Judge Robert Harwick is presiding, and from what I can research quickly, he has a reputation for harsh sentences and little patience for what he considers excuses from defendants. "Ben, they're treating our son like a career criminal over charges that don't make any sense." Benjamin absorbed this information while calculating his response options. His position as Supreme Court Justice provided enormous influence, but also required careful consideration of how personal involvement might affect his judicial responsibilities and public perception. Direct intervention could be seen as abuse of power, while inaction might mean watching his son become a victim of the same systemic problems he'd spent his career trying to address through legal precedent. "I'm driving to Millbrook immediately," he decided. "Call the best criminal defense attorney in the region and have them meet us at the courthouse. I'll handle this appropriately, but I won't let Jaylen be railroaded by a system that should protect him." The 3-hour drive to Millbrook County gave Benjamin time to consider strategy and remember his own journey through the legal system. 40 years earlier, he'd been a young black law student facing professors and classmates who questioned whether he belonged in elite academic institutions. The difference was that Benjamin had possessed supportive mentors and clear evidence of his capabilities, while Jaylen faced accusers whose credibility seemed accepted without scrutiny. Benjamin's rise through the federal judiciary had been marked by careful attention to constitutional principles and deep respect for procedural fairness. He'd authored opinions protecting defendants' rights, ensuring equal treatment under law, and requiring that evidence meet rigorous standards before being used to convict citizens. Now those abstract principles were becoming personal in ways he'd never anticipated. During the drive, Benjamin called several trusted colleagues to inform them of his temporary absence from court business. Chief Justice Margaret Bell expressed immediate concern and offered any assistance necessary to ensure Jaylen received fair treatment. Several other justices privately shared their own experiences with family members facing legal challenges, reminding Benjamin that judicial families weren't immune from the system's imperfections. Benjamin also reached out to former clerks who'd become prominent attorneys, asking them to research Judge Harwick's background and recent decisions. The information they provided painted a troubling picture of a judge who seemed more interested in processing cases quickly than ensuring careful consideration of evidence and defendants' rights. As he approached Millbrook County, Benjamin reflected on the irony that his son was experiencing firsthand the very problems the Supreme Court addressed through constitutional interpretation. Questions of equal protection, due process, and effective counsel weren't abstract legal concepts when they affected your own family. The statistics about racial disparities in criminal justice that appeared in court briefs represented real teenagers like Jaylen, whose futures hung in the balance. Benjamin's phone buzzed with updates from Angela, who'd arranged for renowned defense attorney Rebecca Walsh to take over Jaylen's representation. Walsh had a reputation for meticulous preparation and fearless advocacy, exactly what this situation required. She was already reviewing the evidence and preparing motions to challenge the arrest and the prosecution's case. The courthouse parking lot was nearly full when Benjamin arrived, suggesting that afternoon dockets were proceeding as scheduled. He sat in his car for a moment, gathering his thoughts and preparing for what he knew would be a defining moment in his family's life. The choice to attend the hearing in person was calculated but risky. His presence would certainly be noticed and reported, potentially creating political complications. But as he thought about Jaylen, sitting in that courtroom, facing charges that could derail his bright future, Benjamin's decision crystallized. Some things mattered more than political considerations, and protecting his son from injustice was certainly one of them. He straightened his tie, checked his judicial identification, and walked toward the courthouse entrance, ready to ensure that the constitutional principles he'd spent his career defending would protect his own child when they were needed most. Rebecca Walsh wasted no time in dismantling the prosecution's case against Jaylen Carter. Within hours of taking over his representation, she'd assembled a team of investigators, student witnesses, and technical experts who began systematically examining every aspect of the alleged drug transaction. Her law firm's conference room quickly transformed into a command center filled with timelines, witness statements, and security footage from multiple sources. The first breakthrough came from Jefferson High School's security system. Walsh's investigators discovered that the school maintained extensive camera coverage of all parking areas, including the gymnasium where the alleged drug sale had occurred. The timestamp evidence was damning for the prosecution. It showed clearly that no transaction matching the witnesses' descriptions had taken place in the alleged location during the specified time period. More importantly, the footage revealed Jaylen's actual whereabouts throughout the afternoon. Security cameras captured him entering the library at 3:15 p.m. and remaining there until 4:25 p.m., just 5 minutes before Officer Bailey's arrival at the school. The alleged drug transaction was supposed to have occurred at 4:00 p.m., making Jaylen's involvement physically impossible. Mrs. Gloria Hampton provided detailed testimony about Jaylen's presence in the library, including specific conversations they'd had about debate strategy and constitutional law concepts. Her written statement included exact quotes from their discussion about Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches, creating powerful irony given Jaylen's current circumstances. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, independently corroborated Jaylen's alibi with checkout records showing and books he'd borrowed at 3:45 p.m. and computer logs documenting his use of research databases until 4:20 p.m. 3 debate team members also provided sworn statements confirming Jaylen's continuous presence in the library throughout the critical time period. Walsh's investigation then turned to the prosecution's witnesses, revealing troubling inconsistencies in their accounts. The 3 students who'd allegedly identified Jaylen as the seller had given statements that contradicted each other on basic details like clothing description, height estimation, and the specific nature of the transaction. They claimed to have witnessed more Concerning was the discovery that all three witnesses had recently been arrested on various charges and were currently working with law enforcement in exchange for favorable treatment in their own cases. This information hadn't been disclosed to the defense, representing a potentially serious violation of prosecutorial obligations to share exculpatory evidence. Private investigator Maria Santos, working for Walsh's firm, uncovered Officer Bailey's disciplinary history through contacts in the police department. Bailey had faced 3 previous complaints for inappropriate conduct during arrests of young black men, though all complaints had been dismissed after cursory internal investigations. The pattern suggested a troubling focus on African American suspects that hadn't been addressed by department leadership. Santos also discovered that the neighborhood where the alleged transaction occurred had been under surveillance by a separate drug task force for several weeks. None of the task force officers had observed any drug activity at Jefferson High School, and their reports specifically noted the absence of distribution activity in areas where Bailey claimed to have evidence of ongoing sales. Angela Carter, leveraging her connections in the civil rights legal community, reached out to families who'd had similar experiences with Officer Bailey's arrests. She discovered 4 other cases in the past 2 years where Bailey had arrested young black men on drug charges that were later dropped due to insufficient evidence. In each case, the initial arrests had created significant disruption to the defendants' lives, even when charges were ultimately dismissed. The pattern that emerged suggested systematic targeting, rather than legitimate law enforcement. Bailey appeared to be focused on arrest statistics rather than actual crime prevention, with little regard for the accuracy of his accusations or the impact on the young men he targeted. Walsh also examined the broader context of drug enforcement in Millbrook County, discovering racial disparities in arrest patterns that seemed to contradict actual drug use statistics. While surveys showed similar rates of drug use across racial groups, arrest records showed disproportionate targeting of young black men, particularly in areas near better schools and affluent neighborhoods. Benjamin Carter, working carefully to avoid any appearance of impropriety, connected Walsh with constitutional law experts who could provide analysis of Fourth Amendment violations in Jaylen's arrest. The legal team identified multiple procedural problems, including the lack of specific probable cause, the failure to properly investigate alibis, and the rush to arrest without adequate evidence review. The evidence-gathering process revealed that this wasn't an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of problematic policing that had gone unchallenged because most victims lacked the resources to mount effective defenses. Jaylen's case was unusual only because his family had the connections and financial means to thoroughly investigate the charges against him. Community activists, led by longtime organizer Jerome Washington, began documenting similar cases and building coalitions to address systematic problems in local law enforcement. Their research revealed that Officer Bailey was part of a unit that had dramatically increased arrest numbers without corresponding increases in conviction rates, suggesting emphasis on statistics rather than legitimate crime fighting. Local NAACP chapter president Dorothy Nash organized community meetings where other families shared their experiences with questionable arrests and prosecutorial pressure to accept plea deals. The meetings revealed a pattern of young black men being pushed toward guilty pleas, even in cases where evidence was weak or contradictory. Walsh's team also discovered that Judge Harwick had an unusually high rate of denying motions filed by public defenders while approving similar motions from private attorneys. Statistical analysis suggested potential bias in his treatment of defendants, represented by overworked public defenders versus those who could afford experienced private counsel. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that Jaylen's case represented an opportunity to challenge not just individual misconduct, but systematic problems that affected numerous families in the community. The question was whether the legal system would respond appropriately when those problems were fully exposed and documented. The courthouse buzzed with unusual energy as word spread that something extraordinary was about to unfold in Judge Harwick's typically routine afternoon docket. Court reporters, bailiffs, and administrative staff had whispered among themselves about the high-profile defense attorney who'd appeared seemingly overnight to represent the teenager facing drug charges. Local attorneys lingered in hallways, sensing that significant legal drama was about to unfold. Judge Robert Harwick entered his courtroom with characteristic authority, his black robes billowing as he assumed his position behind the bench. For 23 years, he'd presided over this courtroom with an iron fist, maintaining order through intimidation and quick processing of cases that kept his docket moving efficiently. His reputation for harsh sentences and impatience with elaborate defenses had earned him respect from prosecutors and fear from defense attorneys. Lisa Mitchell sat at the defense table, her case files scattered in obvious disorganization. She glanced nervously at Rebecca Walsh, who had quietly taken a seat in the gallery rather than officially entering an appearance that might delay proceedings. The transition of legal representation was happening through careful coordination designed to catch the prosecution off guard. The court calls a matter of people versus Jaylen Carter, announced the clerk. Jaylen stood alongside Ms. Mitchell, his posture straight, despite the ordeal of the past 48 hours. His parents sat in the front row of the gallery, Angela taking notes with the practiced efficiency of an experienced attorney, Benjamin maintaining careful composure while observing every detail of the proceedings. Judge Harwick reviewed his papers with visible impatience. Ms. Mitchell, I trust your client is ready to enter a plea today. The prosecution has offered reasonable terms that would resolve this matter efficiently. His tone suggested that accepting the plea deal was expected rather than optional. Your Honor, Ms. Mitchell began hesitantly. My client maintains his innocence and wishes to reject the prosecution's offer. We believe the evidence will show that he was not present at the location where this alleged crime occurred. Judge Harwick's expression hardened immediately. Ms. Mitchell, your client was identified by multiple witnesses engaging in drug distribution on school property. The evidence against him is substantial, and I suggest you advise him to accept the prosecution's generous offer rather than risk the consequences of proceeding to trial, i.e., judge's premature assessment of evidence. That hadn't been presented troubled several observers in the gallery, including 2 appellate attorneys who'd come to watch the proceedings after hearing rumors about the case's unusual circumstances. Furthermore, Judge Harwick continued, his voice taking on a condescending tone, I question whether your inexperience with serious criminal matters serves your client's best interests. Perhaps if you spent less time reading legal theory and more time understanding how these cases actually work in practice, you'd recognize the wisdom of resolving this matter quickly. The public humiliation of a defense attorney in open court created visible discomfort among the legal professionals present. Even prosecutors who regularly appeared before Judge Harwick seemed surprised by the unusual harshness of his comments toward Ms. Mitchell. Your Honor. With respect, Ms. Mitchell attempted to respond, but Judge Harwick cut her off with a dismissive gesture. Respect? You want to discuss respect? This is my courtroom, and I determine what serves the interests of justice. Your client would be well advised to accept responsibility for his actions, rather than wasting the court's time with frivolous defenses. Angela Carter felt her husband tense beside her as Judge Harwick's comments became increasingly inappropriate. Benjamin's legal training told him to document everything for potential appellate review, while his parental instincts urged immediate intervention to protect his son from judicial bias that violated basic principles of fair proceedings. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly uncomfortable as Judge Harwick continued his lecture about the realities of criminal justice and the foolishness of challenging prosecutorial evidence. Several spectators exchanged glances, recognizing that they were witnessing behavior that exceeded normal judicial authority. "Ms. Mitchell," the judge concluded, "I'm prepared to accept your client's guilty plea today, or we can schedule this matter for trial, where he'll face significantly more serious consequences. The choice is simple, and I expect a rational decision." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly opened with deliberate force. Every head turned as Justice Benjamin Carter rose from his seat and walked purposefully down the center aisle, his judicial bearing unmistakable to everyone present. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as he approached the defense table and placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder. "That's enough." "Your Honor," Benjamin said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that commanded respect in the highest court in the nation. "I am Justice Benjamin Carter of the United States Supreme Court, and that young man is my son." Judge Harwick's face drained of all color as the weight of his situation became clear. The Supreme Court Justice's presence transformed the entire dynamic of the courtroom, creating a tension that was palpable to everyone present. Court reporters stopped typing, bailiffs straightened to attention, and even the prosecutor's confident demeanor evaporated instantly. "Justice Carter," Judge Harwick stammered, his previous authority completely undermined by the revelation. I had no idea." "This is highly irregular." Benjamin's expression remained calm but steely as he addressed the court. "What's irregular, Your Honor, is a judge prejudging evidence before it's been presented and publicly humiliating defense counsel for attempting to advocate for her client. What's irregular is presuming guilt without proper consideration of constitutional protections." The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Reynolds, stood uncertainly, clearly recognizing that his routine case had become a potential career-defining moment. The three dubious witnesses sat in the back of the courtroom, suddenly looking far less confident about their testimony. "Your Honor," Benjamin continued, "I respectfully request that you recuse yourself from this case due to the prejudicial comments you've made and your apparent predetermined view of the defendant's guilt. My son deserves the same fair trial that the Constitution guarantees to every American citizen." Rebecca Walsh rose from the gallery and approached the bench. "Your Honor, I'm Rebecca Walsh, and I'm now representing Mr. Carter. I have several motions to file, including a motion to dismiss based on the complete lack of credible evidence against my client." Judge Harwick looked around the courtroom desperately, realizing that his usual methods of intimidation and rushed proceedings would not work in this situation. The presence of a Supreme Court justice, combined with Walsh's reputation for thorough preparation, had completely altered the balance of power in his courtroom. "The court will take a brief recess to consider these developments," Judge Harwick announced, his voice lacking its previous confidence. As he retreated to his chambers, the courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as the magnitude of what had just occurred began to sink in. Justice Carter embraced his son quietly, while Angela Carter approached Rebecca Walsh to coordinate their legal strategy. The systematic dismantling of the prosecution's case was about to begin in earnest, with evidence that would expose not just the weakness of the charges against Jaylen, but the broader pattern of injustice that had allowed such charges to be filed in the first place. The formal resolution of Jaylen Carter's case came swiftly once Rebecca Walsh presented the overwhelming evidence of his innocence to a new judge. Judge Susan Crawford, who had assumed the case after Judge Harwick's recusal, reviewed the security footage, witness statements and timeline evidence with the careful attention that should have characterized the original proceedings. The evidence presented by the defense clearly establishes that Mr. Carter could not have been present at the alleged location during the time frame specified by the prosecution, Judge Crawford announced during the dismissal hearing. Furthermore, the inconsistencies in witness testimony and the failure to properly investigate the defendant's alibi represent serious procedural failures that undermine the integrity of these charges. Assistant District Attorney Reynolds, recognizing the futility of proceeding with such thoroughly discredited evidence, formally moved to dismiss all charges against Jaylen. The moment represented not just personal vindication for the teenager, but a public acknowledgement that the system had failed in its basic obligation to ensure accurate and fair proceedings. However, the legal resolution of Jaylen's case proved to be just the beginning of a broader reckoning with systematic problems in Millbrook County's criminal justice system. The State Attorney General's office, responding to national attention and documented evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, launched a comprehensive investigation into charging patterns and case handling procedures. The investigation revealed disturbing trends that extended far beyond Officer Bailey's arrest practices. Data analysis showed that African American defendants were significantly more likely to be charged with felonies rather than misdemeanors for similar offenses, more likely to be denied bail or offered higher bail amounts, and less likely to receive favorable plea bargains compared to white defendants with similar criminal histories. These disparities couldn't be explained by differences in offense severity or criminal background, suggesting that unconscious bias or intentional discrimination was affecting prosecutorial decision-making throughout the system. The statistical evidence provided concrete documentation of problems that community activists had been highlighting for years. Officer Bailey faced criminal charges for filing false reports and violating civil rights under color of law. The investigation revealed that he had deliberately coached witnesses to identify Jaylen, despite their initial uncertainty, constituting prosecutorial misconduct that had put an innocent teenager at risk of serious criminal penalties. During Bailey's trial, testimony from fellow officers revealed a department culture that prioritized arrest statistics over evidence quality. Officers described pressure from supervisors to increase their arrest numbers, particularly in cases involving drug offenses that carried federal funding, incentives for local law enforcement agencies. The revelation that arrest quotas had influenced Bailey's decision-making sparked calls for comprehensive police reform throughout the county. Community leaders demanded new oversight mechanisms, revised training programs, and accountability measures that would prevent similar misconduct in the future. Judge Harwick faced formal disciplinary proceedings before the State Judicial Conduct Board. His treatment of Lisa Mitchell and his prejudicial comments about Jaylen's guilt violated fundamental principles of judicial neutrality and due process. Testimony from court reporters and attorneys documented a pattern of bias that had affected numerous cases over several years. The Judicial Review Board's investigation revealed that Harwick had consistently treated public defenders with less respect than private attorneys, often rushing through cases involving indigent defendants while allowing more time for well-represented clients. This systematic bias had created a two-tiered justice system based on defendants' economic resources rather than the merits of their cases. Following extensive deliberation, the Judicial Conduct Board suspended Judge Harwick for 6 months without pay and ordered him to complete bias training and anger management counseling before returning to the bench. While some critics argued for more severe penalties, the decision established important precedent for holding judges accountable for prejudicial behavior. The broader impact of these individual accountability measures was amplified by institutional reforms implemented throughout the county's criminal justice system. New policies required supervisory review of all arrests involving minors, mandatory documentation of witness identification procedures, and regular auditing of charging decisions to identify potential discriminatory patterns. Public defender funding received significant increases after advocates demonstrated how inadequate resources had contributed to systemic unfairness. The county hired additional attorneys, investigators, and support staff to ensure that indigent defendants received effective representation comparable to that available to paying clients. Rebecca Walsh leveraged the attention generated by Jaylen's case to establish a legal clinic focused on wrongful prosecution cases. The clinic provided free representation to defendants facing questionable charges while also collecting data about prosecutorial misconduct that could inform broader reform efforts. Law enforcement training programs were redesigned to emphasize constitutional protections, cultural sensitivity, and evidence-based policing strategies. Officers received instruction about unconscious bias and were required to demonstrate understanding of Fourth Amendment principles before being certified for independent patrol duties. The reforms extended beyond individual accountability to address institutional cultures that had enabled systematic bias. Police departments implemented new supervision protocols. Judicial administration created bias monitoring systems, and prosecutorial offices established case review procedures designed to catch discriminatory patterns before they affected defendants' lives. Community oversight committees gained real authority to review complaints, access departmental records, and recommend policy changes. These civilian review boards included diverse membership representing different perspectives and experiences within the county's population. Educational initiatives brought constitutional law instruction to high schools throughout the county, ensuring that young people understood their rights during police encounters. Students learned about due process protections, the importance of legal representation, and their responsibilities as future jurors in maintaining fair criminal justice proceedings. The transformation wasn't achieved without resistance from those comfortable with previous arrangements. Some law enforcement officers complained that new oversight mechanisms interfered with their ability to fight crime effectively, while certain prosecutors argued that enhanced scrutiny would make it harder to secure convictions in legitimate cases. However, statistical monitoring showed that crime rates remained stable even as arrest patterns became more equitable and prosecutorial decisions faced greater scrutiny. The evidence suggested that fairer procedures didn't compromise public safety, but simply ensured that law enforcement resources were used more effectively and constitutionally. Justice Benjamin Carter observed these developments with satisfaction, recognizing that his son's ordeal had catalyzed changes that would protect countless other young people from similar injustices. The personal trauma had been transformed into public good through sustained community engagement and institutional commitment to reform. 2 years after the courthouse confrontation that changed everything, Jaylen Carter stood at the podium of Harvard Law School's orientation ceremony, addressing incoming first-year students as the recipient of the school's prestigious Civil Rights Leadership Scholarship. The confident young man who spoke that day bore little resemblance to the frightened teenager who had once sat in a detention cell facing false charges that could have derailed his future. 2 years ago, I learned that innocence isn't always enough, Jaylen told the packed auditorium. I discovered that the constitutional protections we study in textbooks don't automatically protect us in courtrooms. But I also learned that individual courage, combined with community action and institutional accountability, can transform systems that seem unchangeable. His scholarship, funded by donations from across the country, specifically supported students committed to civil rights advocacy and criminal justice reform. Jaylen's story had inspired countless Americans to contribute to educational opportunities for young people facing similar challenges, creating a lasting legacy that extended far beyond his personal experience. The reforms implemented in Millbrook County had become a model for jurisdictions across the nation. The Carter Protocols, as they came to be known, established comprehensive guidelines for juvenile arrests, judicial conduct, and prosecutorial decision-making that other communities adapted to their local circumstances. Legal scholars studied the systematic changes as examples of how individual cases could catalyze broader institutional transformation. Officer Bailey had been convicted of civil rights violations and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison followed by community service specifically focused on educating young people about their constitutional rights. His case established important precedent for holding law enforcement officers accountable when they violated citizens' civil liberties through deliberately false accusations. Judge Harwick completed his suspension and bias training, returning to the bench with noticeably changed behavior toward public defenders and indigent defendants. While some critics questioned whether meaningful change was possible for someone with such entrenched biases, court observers noted genuine improvements in his treatment of all attorneys and defendants appearing before him. The most significant changes occurred at the institutional level, where new policies and oversight mechanisms created lasting protections for future defendants. Arrest review boards now examined all cases involving minors within 24 hours, ensuring that questionable charges were identified and addressed before young people spent days or weeks in detention based on insufficient evidence. Public defender offices throughout the state received increased funding and support, reducing caseloads to manageable levels and providing resources necessary for effective representation. The quality of indigent defense improved dramatically, creating more equitable outcomes regardless of defendants' economic circumstances. Rebecca Walsh had established the Millbrook Justice Center, a legal clinic that provided free representation while also training law students in constitutional advocacy. The center handled dozens of cases annually, often involving young people whose situations mirrored Jaylen's experience with false accusations and systematic bias. What we learned from Jaylen's case, Walsh explained to visiting law students, is that injustice thrives in darkness but withers under scrutiny. Our job is to shine light on problematic practices and provide concrete alternatives that protect everyone's constitutional rights. The community transformation extended beyond legal institutions to include educational initiatives that reached thousands of young people annually. High schools throughout the county now required constitutional law courses that taught students about their rights during police encounters and their responsibilities as future jurors. Mrs. Gloria Hampton, who had been promoted to principal of Jefferson High School, integrated these lessons throughout the curriculum. "We don't just teach civics as abstract theory," she explained. "We help students understand how constitutional principles affect their daily lives and their future participation in democratic institutions." Justice Benjamin Carter reflected on these changes during quiet moments in his Supreme Court chambers, where he continued addressing constitutional questions that affected millions of Americans. Jaylen's experience had deepened his understanding of how abstract legal principles translated into real-world consequences for individual families. "The law is only as strong as our commitment to applying it fairly," he had written in a recent opinion, addressing prosecutorial misconduct. "Constitutional protections mean nothing if they're not consistently enforced for all citizens, regardless of their race, economic status, or family connections." Angela Carter had used her experience to establish a legal defense fund specifically focused on wrongful prosecution cases involving young people. The fund provided grants to families who couldn't afford private attorneys, while also supporting research into discriminatory charging patterns that affected juvenile defendants. The statistical monitoring systems implemented in Millbrook County revealed encouraging trends toward more equitable law enforcement and judicial outcomes. Arrest disparities had decreased significantly. Prosecutorial charging decisions showed greater consistency across racial lines, and conviction rates remained stable despite more careful evidence review. Jaylen's advocacy work continued throughout his college years, as he spoke at conferences, testified before legislative committees, and mentored other young people who had faced similar challenges. His transformation from victim to advocate demonstrated the potential for personal trauma to become a catalyst for positive social change. "I never wanted to become a symbol," he reflected during a recent interview. But I've learned that sometimes circumstances choose us rather than the other way around. The question isn't whether we face challenges, but how we respond when they arise. The broader impact of his case extended far beyond Millbrook County, inspiring similar reforms in communities across the nation. Civil rights organizations used his story to illustrate how individual courage could challenge systematic injustice, while legal educators incorporated his experience into curricula focused on constitutional advocacy. As Jaylen prepared to begin his legal education, he carried with him not just the memory of injustice faced, but the knowledge that determined individuals could create lasting change when they refused to accept unacceptable conditions. His father's strategic patience, his mother's advocacy skills, and his own growth from victim to leader had combined to transform personal trauma into public good. The courthouse where Judge Harwick had once mocked his public defender now displayed a plaque commemorating the constitutional reforms that emerged from that day's events. The inscription read simply, "Justice delayed is justice denied." But justice, achieved through courage and perseverance, protects us all. What started as one teenager's wrongful arrest had become a blueprint for systematic reform, proving that individual courage, properly channeled through legal institutions and community action, could indeed create the more perfect union that America's founders had envisioned but never fully achieved.